don't I start, and it looks like there are people still joining, but I can kind of set the table here for
Yeah.
what's happening. So tonight is kind of a continuation of what we heard about last week, which was a very creative and purposeful um, co-op housing model. And we've got a bunch of experts on this Zoom to talk about that. And I'm not sure how, I think I'm gonna start with Sarah, but maybe people will join in. So Sarah Page is here. She's from Massachusetts, and she actually was very, very involved in helping Kathy Ludlam and George set up her housing co-op.
Can you put the volume? Can you put the volume on?
Yeah. And by
This, so I
the
can
way,
hear it?
yeah.
Speaker? Yeah, okay.
No,
Okay, and
there's 5 of them
John,
each. Well, you get my
yeah,
money
John,
back.
what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute
right.
everybody, and then you're going to have to turn your mic back on.
Oh, all right.
Okay. You need to turn your mic on, John.
Yep. Okay.
Got it.
Now you should be able to hear me. So Sarah Page was involved in helping Kathy and George, and she's going to talk a little bit more about that and some other stuff. She's got a long history of experience with all kinds of housing solutions. And then we've got Bob Marshall, who you have seen on these before. He lived in a co-op in Massachusetts, and I think he was involved in helping create one. We also have James Comer on. He's from Rhode Island Housing, and although he's not directly working on co-ops and co-op housing at the moment, he does have quite a bit of experience with that topic, and I think he can become our subject matter expert in Rhode Island. And so I'm really glad that he's on. Jessica Mowry lassoed him into helping us with this thing, and I appreciate her efforts, and I appreciate James's willingness to help out. And then finally, and maybe firstly, you have me. So as we've gotten involved in this stuff, I became very aware that I knew way more about co-housing, co-op and co-op type housing than I thought of, because my mother lived in one of those units in Connecticut after I grew up and moved out of the house. The short version of the story is that my father, who was quite young, developed terminal cancer and passed away while I was away in college. And my mother was raising my 3-year-old sister, and they became very financially strapped, because in those days there wasn't nearly as much help for people with any kinds of chronic illnesses, in particular cancer. And so basically the cancer bankrupted my mother. She spent a year living with her sister, and in the meantime, she saved up some money, and she wanted to move out, and she looked around whether she wanted to rent or to buy. And she had a very strong bias towards buying. So she learned about a place called Success Village in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which was a huge co-op housing that was built about the early 1950s. And she saw somebody had an ad in the paper for a unit, so she thought she was going to be looking at a, like a small house or something. We showed up and we saw this, like about 100 big buildings with maybe 6 or 8 unit apartments in each one. We went through a pretty rigorous interview to make sure that she understood what was going on, and she bought it, and she lived there for about 20 years. Very happy there. My mother was a very private, shy kind of person. And she actually developed a good friendship with both of her neighbors, who thankfully were not as shy as she was. And both of her neighbors were families. They, husband, wife, and a couple of children on both sides. And she lived there until she was pretty old. And then Connie and we moved out to the East Coast and convinced her that although she couldn't live with us, because I don't think she wanted to, we could help her get into Warwick public housing. And although she was out of stater, it took a little bit more effort and longer time. She eventually ended up living in a housing unit about 5-minute walk from my house, our house. And she lived there for nearly 20 years. And in those 20 years, her youngest grandchild, Mark, our son, he would go down and visit her, would wheel down there in his wheelchair, visit her and spend time with grandma, and started getting to know some of the residents. And then, I don't know, 10 years after his grandmother passed away, Mark ended up moving down to that same complex. And it was amazing to discover that there were residents in there who still remembered him as a little kid in a wheelchair who would come to visit his grandmother. So talk about networking, social capital, all of those really good things that make it possible to live in a good space, emotionally and physically. He had it, all of it kind of by accident, and all of it kind of built around his grandmother's housing needs. So that's my own co-op housing question and my story. And my question has always been, how come I don't see more co-op housing here in Rhode Island? And maybe at some point James will enlighten us finally, and I can stop asking that question. So I think I've kind of done my time with this. Oh, you've lost me again, I can tell. I just realized. Okay, so Sarah, I think David's going to open up your microphone, and maybe you might want to just kind of tell about yourself a little bit.
Sure. Well, I'm Sarah Page. I'm from Massachusetts, as John said, and I worked for 10 years in Connecticut and just loved every minute of working with Kathy and her circle on housing co-ops. And I, like so many people in New England, like George and Kathy and many others, were really inspired by David Weatherow coming and giving talks about the housing co-op model that he and his friends and families and colleagues developed in Winnipeg. And many of us were inspired by that and tried to figure out how to do that here. And so I ended up developing one in Massachusetts and a few in Connecticut. And, it was, they were successful. But as Kathy said, there are challenges and downsides to it. And I think, hers was fabulous for the first 10 years. It had challenges then, but I know she described to you property management and having to work with other people. And so the vision of a co-op is that it's one of the models that allows you to get together with other people and co-own and really work together to manage and work together on your housing. And so it creates this structure that brings people together. But there's a whole lot of challenges that go with that. Running a housing complex is complicated. And So some have run into problems over the years, but then there are still consultants who are helping people develop them. And, you know, some of the challenges that occurred, people have learned from. So for example, Kathy's co-op now has a management company, and that took a huge load off of the members of the co-op. So I just want to go back to, you know, kind of where people came from in developing these co-ops. And Kathy's was typical. She had a very clear geography she wanted to live in. And so we were looking at certain towns outside of Hartford. She didn't want to live in Hartford. She grew up in a suburb of Hartford, and that was what made sense. She wanted to build relationships into where she lived so that she could rely on people. You know, one story that I always go back to is one of the people with disabilities who moved into her co-op. There were 4 wheelchair accessible units, and he had a problem with his live-in assistant, and I think the assistant took his keys, and one of the neighbors ran after that person and got the keys back. And, you know, there really was a sense that you could just call on a neighbor and rely on them. And, you know, in the beginning, they did sweat equity together. They did a lot of planning. They went through training. And so there really was a cohesive group that moved in the beginning. But it's very hard to keep that 30 years later. And, you know, it's conceivable that you would, but she had circle members who moved in when it started, and then they were able to, they got different jobs and they moved a little farther away. And so, you know, it's just not a be all end all model answer, but it has a lot of advantages. And the other key advantage is that there have been and continue to be funding programs that either were designed for co-ops or can be used to create co-ops. And the other piece of that is that you can often make them somewhat mixed income, because you don't want to keep higher income people who are friends of yours out, but you often need to have really affordable units. So one reason that I lived in Massachusetts and ended up working intensely in Connecticut is that Connecticut had an amazing funding program specifically for housing co-ops. And they were for sweat equity co-ops. And the advantage of that was everybody did some physical labor together to build the co-ops. And so that too really brought people together and gave them a sense of ownership together. I'll just mention the difference between co-ops and condos, because you can certainly do the same thing in a condominium complex where you're co-owning together. In co-op, you have a proprietary lease, so you don't actually own your unit, but you have a long-term lease, and then you can sell that lease and the value that comes along with being able to live in that unit, as opposed to a co-op where you actually own your unit. So some of the thinking has been that if you're not just owning your unit, but you're kind of co-owning everything, it gives you a better sense of cooperation and collaboration. I'm not really sure that that's necessarily so important, but there really haven't been the same kind of affordable housing programs for condos as there have been for limited equity co-ops. And so a limited equity co-op is the other piece of what most of the co-ops that that I've been involved with and that have really been used by people for these kinds of community building are that there's a lot of public money involved, and then people can't just gain complete market profit. They have to, they only will get a formula. They'll only get back funding based on a formula they agreed to when they moved in. So, so it's much less than market, than being able to sell it, but they didn't invest a huge amount in the beginning. And it's designed to make it affordable for the next families who come along. So I just wanted to mention, so now that co-op housing funding program in Connecticut is long gone, and it's hard to find funding that's really designed for co-ops. So you have to use funding sources and put all the pieces together, which is the case of almost any housing development these days. You often have to put numerous different sources together to make it work. But what you typically use now are low-income housing tax credits. And that's what many developers use when they're creating mixed income housing that will have affordable units. And that's what we used on co-ops after Kathy's, where this amazing co-op funding had gone away. And so that's kind of what I wanted to say about co-ops. John kind of told me some of your questions. One was they can be huge and they can be small. And, you know, I think you heard about Mary Ann Langton's co-op. I think hers was about 6 units. Kathy's was 16 units. We did one after Kathy's that was 25. And the more units you have, the more kind of financially viable it is, the more people are paying in. So if you have someone who isn't paying their co-op fee, and you can't really get rid of them right away, then, you know, that's not going to make as big a difference because you've got many people paying their co-op fees. And it also makes it easier to develop because the more units you have, the more cost effectiveness and economies of scale you get. And management companies usually want to manage like 100 units, not 20. And so, but if you're trying to create community, you don't want to be trying to create a community with 50 people or 50 families. You probably want something small like what Kathy had and what she really wanted. And the one in West Hartford that Mary Ann had, I think was 6 units. And that was, you know, that really worked well too. So, so today, if you want to develop affordable housing and you want to develop a co-op, there certainly are consultants out there that you can ask to help you. But I also want to caution that if you decide to kind of become a housing developer, it's a whole long ride, as I know people have told you. And there are lots of people developing housing. There are lots of housing complexes that exist already. And there are lots of ways to create community without trying to decide that you're going to really go it alone, create this whole housing development. So there are advantages, as Kathy explained, but there are a lot of disadvantages. So when Kathy and I got started in Connecticut, we looked at other developments that were being developed. There were other co-ops, there were mutual housing developments, both designed to bring everybody together to work together. And there was a big co-op being developed in Waterbury, and we were able to help lots of people with disabilities connect with that co-op development. And they became critical pieces, and it actually changed people's thinking in Connecticut because they hadn't really thought of reaching out to people with disabilities. And what we did was say, you know, you need to include people, and there are all these people in Waterbury who want to live here. And it made a huge difference because the state of Connecticut started thinking, oh, well, you know, we're developing affordable units, but we shouldn't just leave them unoccupied. We need, or, you know, accessible units. We need people with disabilities to actually use them. And so you can really make a difference in how people think about really including people in housing. And there are lots of developments that exist or are being built that you could advocate to be a part of. And so, you know, the other thing that we did that was really exciting was Connecticut had these affordable developments being done, and they had all these square footage requirements. And they said, you know, this is the biggest a bedroom can be. And, you know, I understand it was an affordability issue, but Kathy and her circle members realized that you couldn't have a Hoyer lift helping her get in and out of bed and have anything else in the room and, you know, deal with these square footage requirements. So I took pictures of Hoyer lifts to the Department of Housing and said, you know, you're not allowing people to develop housing that actually meets the needs of lots of people with disabilities. So you have to change this. And so they did. They changed the requirements and allowed much more room in accessible units. They allowed you to have a live-in assistant. And we were able to make a lot of changes in policy because we had real people with real needs, and we were willing to go and just really advocate for change. And so that can be done in any kind of development. And it certainly is a pet peeve of mine that states and federal money are used to develop accessible units. You have to, as a developer, include a certain number, but you don't have to market them to people with disabilities, and you don't have to design them to really meet people's needs. So, you know, there's a huge need for people to go and tell developers what is needed. And I know that some of your family members have cognitive disabilities, not physical disabilities. And I developed a co-op in Amherst with families that really was designed to meet the needs of people with developmental disabilities. And you know, the kind of thinking about how to include people, how to make sure people are accepted and feel really a part of the community are just, you know, slightly different than what Kathy's co-op involved, but absolutely can be done. And it doesn't have to be a co-op. It could be any kind of housing that you're just really putting out to the housing folks the vision, the need, you know, the beauty of including everybody, and also the fact, the civil rights issue that people have been excluded. And you know, I know you're going to hear about fair housing. You know, it's a fair housing issue that people with disabilities often didn't get their needs met in housing and were sent to specialized housing, and that we all need to be making sure that people are really included in all the housing that's developed. And that's still something that needs more advocacy, and you can certainly play an important part in that. Oh, then John wanted me to mention the whole issue of housing discrimination in suburbs and how there's just so much not in my backyard fervor that gets going when people hear that affordable housing is going to come to their community. And some of it is just crazy. You know, Mary Ann's co-op of 6 units was had so much opposition that they filled a huge gym in a school with people opposing it. And, you know, fortunately, a foundation and the interfaith group, everyone went to bat and said, you know, this is ridiculous. You have to let us develop this. But after some of the opposition like that in Connecticut, Connecticut passed laws that really were similar to statutes in Massachusetts that say if your town does, at least the Massachusetts one, and I think the Connecticut one is pretty similar, that if you don't have 10% of the housing in your town as affordable, then a developer can come in and propose a big development that's outside of potentially your typical zoning. And you have to prove why it would be a huge problem in your town, which is typically pretty hard to do. And so it's been a great incentive for towns to say, boy, we better have 10% because a developer can come in and do something that may be really out of scale for that community. So it both allows developers to develop affordable housing, and it's been a deterrent of people thinking they can just block every housing development. And so I think John thinks that it would be great to look at that kind of legislation and see if in Rhode Island you have something similar, something that could be strengthened, or, you know, it sounds like you may want to look at that kind of policy change. But it's not like you would have to go out and do that yourselves. There are all kinds of housing groups that you can link up with. And certainly in all the work that I've done with families and people with disabilities, we've linked up with lots of other housing advocates and been a part of a larger movement to make housing more available.
Sarah, Connie Souza has just asked a little quick question at the beginning. What percentage of individuals with disabilities are living in the Waverly co-op?
Oh, and Kathy's co-op?
Or Waterbury, rather.
Oh, the Waterbury. Well, most of them, I think that the state required 10% of the units available to be wheelchair accessible. And so the norm in the work we did in Connecticut and other people did was 10 to 20%. And,
Thanks.
you know, we tried to keep it pretty low.
Thank you.
So do people have other questions? Those were some of the pieces I really wanted to cover. And what I think John wanted me to cover.
Sarah, one of Asha has been asking, and I've been direct messaging back and forth about the in a co-op, because it's not owner equity, it's a collective equity. The ones I've been involved in, people who are moving in generally buy a share in the co-op at a nominal cost, and then there's an occupancy charge. And I was suggesting, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, that typically the price of the shares is equal regardless of income. The occupancy cost are often scheduled based on income testing,
Right.
and that accomplishes so when you move out, you get your share back, but you're not taking equity out. But the share is a reasonable amount the share is a reasonable amount of money. And the other thing that we were learning was that the fact that that the equity stays with the co-op is the reason that the state feels comfortable in applying as much financial subsidy to the enterprise. Because it's gonna remain beneficial for a lot of people for a long time. Okay, just wanted to check that out. Thank you.
Yeah, well, and I'll say that with Kathy's co-op, they did sweat equity, which included the training they went to and doing work on the co-op. So friends of Kathy's did some of her sweat equity, and then she brought her brilliance and all of her organizational skills and contributed that. So she didn't actually, and her co-op members didn't have to pay. They got, they put in all this effort that became their share. But then when they left, that had a value, and then it did appreciate. But it didn't, as you said, appreciate to a market value. It just, there was a formula and they knew how much it would appreciate. And, it's different in different places. Like in Massachusetts, you do have to buy in, but again, it's a small amount. And yes, the rents can be hugely different depending on incomes.
So Sarah, do you have to pay beside this monthly rent too?
Say that again? I'm sorry.
You have to pay the rent monthly beside you own this place?
Oh yeah, there's absolutely a monthly fee to cover all the costs of maintaining that property.
Okay, so what are the average costs you're talking for these kind of things? I have no idea because this is all new to me.
Sure. Well, the cost, the fee or the rent is based on your income. So for people with very, very low incomes, if it's 30% of their income, it's a very small amount. Whereas higher income people, 30% is significantly more. But the way that happens, the co-op program that we used for Kathy's co-op was completely grants. So there was no debt on her co-op, which made it able to remain incredibly affordable. So people's fees were just going to maintenance, a reserve for future repairs, and all the costs of just running a housing development. But that was, as I said, just kind of a unique time, and nobody's giving grants today for housing. You've got to use low-income housing tax credits that come with lots more strings attached. You've got to find money in all different ways. You probably will have loans and equity to pay back. So it's not at all as straightforward as her co-op was. But again, there are public funds available to make units affordable for people who need them.
I see. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just want to also add, for Asha's sake, when we talk about it being based on an individual's income, that is deemed only as the income of the person who is going to move in, not of their family members. Is that correct, Sarah?
Right, unless their family members are going to live with them.
Right.
But right, the income is based on just the household income of the people who live there. And typically, if you need live-in assistance, their income would not be considered part of the household income, because they're there to support the person, and they're getting paid probably, or getting free room. So they're not part of the household income.
So Sarah, do you have to pay the taxes too on this one? Just like condo, you pay taxes and stuff. When you own the house, you go for the closing cost and you go through the whole thing. Do you have to go through this whole thing?
No, the only taxes that are being paid are by the co-op, and some of these were really nonprofit entities, so they weren't paying much real estate tax. Actually, we did make sure they paid some real estate tax because we might have been able to get around that, but we felt it was really important. There were lots of children there going to the schools, and they were going to benefit from all the services in the town. So so the co-op itself paid taxes to the town, but they don't own their unit in the same way that that they would be paying taxes on their particular unit.
Can you buy it at the flat rates?
Can you buy-
Like when you're buying in the beginning, can you buy it with whatever the amount is? Can you buy it and own it, or how
No.
that works?
Well, these co-op units, you can't buy the way you could a condo. But,
Right.
you may want to buy a condo. You can create community in a condo complex if that's how you approach it and that's your intention. So, I want to caution that doing a co-op has had advantages, but it's not a magic solution. The magic solution is building relationships and having people who care about you and having people who are going to go to bat for you and advocate for you. And that's the most important piece. And we just use the co-op model. Today, I would look at a condo model, or I think that people should look at simpler solutions like finding an apartment in an apartment building that's affordable, where they know some people in the building and they can build relationships in other ways. There are lots of ways to approach how to live independently with the support you need, with the friends around you that you need. And that's what that's what the goal typically is.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
So why don't we give Sarah a break, let her regain her voice. And I'm wondering if maybe James, if you could kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about this whole issue of co-op housing, and as from your perspective and from your experience.
Sure, I'd be happy to. My name is James Comer. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Rhode Island Housing, which is the state housing finance agency. So if you're developing affordable housing in Rhode Island, you've gotten some money from us, basically. We do single family lending as well as multifamily lending. And there are thousands of units throughout the state that we financed or have a mortgage on. Prior to being at Rhode Island Housing, I ran a nonprofit housing development company out of Providence, but we did work in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And then prior to that, I was with the Cambridge Housing Authority, the Fall River Housing Authority, and the Boston Housing Authority. So
You've been around.
you get around in housing. There's only a few people who want to do it, so you keep getting jobs. It works out okay. But it's a benefit of all that is I've had a good bit of experience in different places with different challenges, and certainly, to follow on what Sarah said, it's she was 100% correct in her assessment of the challenges to developing co-op housing, and sort of the restrictions upon funding that make it more challenging, and what's available. I will tell you candidly, as far as serving the population that you folks are interested in, the co-op model has not been the most successful model I've seen, from my experience, for a lot of the reasons that Sarah laid out. It is very challenging to sustain a co-op over time that I've seen. Initially, oftentimes it's a collective group of very like-minded individuals who have some association with one another on a social level or on a, belonging to the same groups, that type of thing, who are animated by a common purpose. And it works out really well that they have this bond that leads to cooperative housing being a successful model. But as folks, move out and other folks move in, that tends to change over time. And it's not as rosy as it once was when you all knew each other. And when you were all, the kind of sweat equity model that Sarah was talking about is fantastic, and it's great because it's a real bonding tool, and there's a commonality of purpose. But as new people come in and maybe they're more interested in, less interested in doing that and just more interested in doing their own thing, it can kind of become more challenging. And I think certainly, and we talk about this not just in terms of cooperative housing, but in terms of anyone who's developing housing, whatever you think property management is going to be, it's going to be twice that. It is an enormous challenge, no matter what kind of building. If you build a new building, if you redevelop an older building, however you slice it, it's always going to be more of a nut than you think it's going to be, both in terms of cost and in terms of experience. Like, you don't know what you don't know until you're in that position when you're managing property. And it is something that it is almost always, unless you are a more sophisticated housing developer and can do it yourself, it's almost always worth it to pay somebody because it's going to be cheaper in the long run. But it's not cheap to begin with, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But in terms of the physical maintenance, in terms of the interpersonal management piece of things, it's helpful to have a third party to diffuse that. I know obviously the cooperative model is built on exactly that, cooperation and people working together, but that doesn't always sustain in practice. And it's helpful to have a kind of a third party arbiter to manage those issues when they come up and do it in a dispassionate, disinterested way. To Sarah's point again, the best tool for development that we would have in Rhode Island is the low-income housing tax credit. But because that, and I'll try to give you the very short version of the low-income housing tax credit, it's apportioned to the states along population. And so we in Rhode Island have what's called the small state minimum, which is about $3 million worth of credit per year. So practically speaking, what that means is we're able to do about 3 projects a year with the financing we have. In Massachusetts, they get a lot more tax credits because they have more people. Same thing in Connecticut. So they have a little bit more leeway to fund more projects certainly every year and have a little bit more. I don't want to say creativity because I don't want to damn us with false praise, but they can expand their models a little bit differently than we can because we have such a scarcity of resources. Similar to that, a lot of the other supporting resources, because, and again, I could have just sat there and nodded politely while Sarah was talking the whole time because she hit on so many of the points, that I would otherwise have made. That alone is not going to develop the housing. You need what we call a capital stack. You need a number of different sources to put it all together to make any kind of housing development work. And I was nodding vigorously when she said, the more units you have, the more attractive it's going to be, not only from a property management standpoint, but the more it's going to pencil out in terms of financial feasibility. When we look at tax credit properties, usually a minimum of 30 units is where we want to start. Like 30 to 45 is kind of like the sweet spot for it's manageable, but it also has an economy of scale that you get it to work on paper financially.
Yep.
It sounds counterintuitive, but it's more expensive to operate a 25 unit development than it is a 40 unit development because the operating costs per unit go up, the construction costs per unit go up. It's, not materially cheaper in terms of actually building it, it's marginally cheaper. And those costs just get magnified on a per unit basis. And organizations like mine, and to something Sarah said as well, there are limits we have to how much we can fund per unit, per development. So that goes for construction, that goes for total cost, et cetera. So if you're looking at a 10 or 15 unit co-op, it's not going to be competitive for low-income housing tax credits in Rhode Island. It's just, it wouldn't, not just a cooperative, a 15-unit tax credit development that was just a standard rental development wouldn't really be competitive either for all of the same reasons. So it's one of the things that I think is important in thinking about these things. And it is something that I've seen happen time and again, unfortunately, is there are wonderful community organizations that do great work with the populations that they work for. They are passionate about their mission. They are committed. They are dedicated. They're working 20 hours a day to get things done. And they come across a piece of property, or someone leaves them a piece of property, you know, in a bequest, or for some reason they acquire real estate in some fashion and they want to develop housing for their community, which is awesome, which is what we want to support. But they don't have the capacity to do that. They're not housing developers. They're mission folks. And that's great. They need to partner with somebody who knows how to develop housing. Because I will tell you candidly, with the pipeline we have in Rhode Island and the scarcity of resources we have on a federal level, many experienced housing developers are unsuccessful simply because the money runs out. And a novice group of housing developers, through no fault of their own, obviously, just don't have the expertise to put together these successful applications. They're not easy. They don't oftentimes, and I say this to people all the time, they don't make sense unless you live in our world. The way a tax credit deal comes together on its face it's not logical, right? Nonprofit developers get these allocations of tax credits. Well, they don't pay taxes. So what do? They can turn around and sell them to a citizens bank, a corporate investor who pays them 95 cents on the dollar for these tax credits. Already, it's a weird transaction. And, you know, it's just not an organic thing to put these type of things together. There are many consultants out there who help groups do that. There are many nonprofit developers that partner with groups. We certainly did. You know, when I was at Women's Development Corporation, we partnered with other nonprofits to give them technical assistance and help them with projects that they wanted to do. But all of those things, you know, are to say that it's a very challenging environment to start from scratch and do something like this.
Right.
The
James,
positive thing is we're in a climate right now in the affordable housing world where what I tend to call special population housing or special purpose housing is, you know, people are finally realizing that there's a great need for this. I mean, there's a great need for all sorts of affordable housing across the spectrum. God knows we don't have anywhere near enough. But there are models that are arising that are starting to get some traction with non-traditional funders, with state funders, to understand that it is exceptionally difficult for these kind of special population groups to develop housing because that's not where they come from. And how can we build supports into that so they can build that capacity, so they can hire consultants, so that they can make these unique housing situations work on an operating basis with some ongoing support, whether it be for the housing portion or for supportive services as necessary. So it's, you know, it is bubbling up there. It's not where it needs to be, but I will tell you, just to give an example of a project we did when I was at Women's Development Corporation, we got a project approved and funded to build 30 units of veterans housing in New Bedford. And of those 30 units, 23 were kind of enhanced studios for single folks, single veterans to live in. And there was going to be a service component we would bring in as well. But we carved out 7 units for veterans that needed live-in care or live-in support, let's say. It wasn't always necessarily care. Sometimes it was just that they needed to live with a sibling or with a parent because of their particular needs, whether it be emotional health, behavioral health, cognitive disabilities that they had incurred through their service, or some folks, of course, with physical disabilities as well. And within the overall structure of that, we were able to make that work financially and make it work where they were both in units that were appropriate for their needs and with the appropriate supports that they required, but within a larger community of affordable housing, particularly with folks who had similar life experiences, even if they themselves did not have disabilities. They were all veterans. They were all, you know, had that kind of common bond, and they were integrated into this community organically. And it worked from a financing model and from kind of a social and service provision model. So that was really cool that we got to do that. Again, unfortunately, there's an enormous lack of veterans housing. And as you guys probably understand, veterans suffer from physical, behavioral, mental disabilities in larger portion than the general population. They also suffer from substance abuse issues in a larger percentage than the general population. And so it's critical that the housing that people develop for that population has these supports built into it and has these community aspects that I think are really vital to people's well-being built into them already, because that fits their particular need. Again, I think that type of model does work really well. Another example that I worked on using low-income housing tax credits many years ago, almost 20 years ago now, in Cambridge, we converted an elderly housing development to an elderly housing development, but that had a built-in assisted living facility within it. The first affordable assisted living facility in the country financed by tax credits, with the idea that people could age in place in the building they had lived in. And it would be a much better progress for them in the course of their lives. And they would get to stay in their community. They would stay with their friends. They would stay in the neighborhood that they loved, in their supportive environment, while transitioning to a situation that was more appropriate for their activities of daily life, and allow them, to kind of transition with dignity into a different phase of their life without having to sacrifice all of their money, without having to sacrifice the comfort and the stability and support of a community. And, again, that model proved very successful, both from a financial standpoint and from a kind of a social and a service provision standpoint.
James,
sorry.
yeah, James, can I interrupt you for just a
Yeah,
moment
please.
and ask a question? A number of years ago, I was doing this work in Manitoba, in the Canadian province of Manitoba. And at one point we had a minister of housing, which is like the secretary of housing in a state, who that part of government was very, very often in the business of providing ordinary developers with loan guarantees for the development process. So, for example, I had an office in a 17-unit or 17-story apartment building, and Muriel Smith, who was the Minister of Housing at that time, had a standing offer to developers that we'll give you your loan guarantee, but what we want in return is for you to develop a certain number of affordable units, or a certain number of wheelchair accessible units, or a certain number of accessible units, and one little cubby hole where staff could stay overnight and be available to somebody if they needed it, and that worked really well. Is there a parallel available in Rhode Island, where the people who are developing typical housing construction come to the government looking for not so much tax credits, but loan guarantees and things like that could be leveraged?
So we as I said, we do multifamily lending for housing development, for affordable housing development, and that's separate and apart from the tax credit program. But generally speaking, those developments are either 100% affordable, or there are some mixed income developments where the market rate units will subsidize the affordable piece with the rents that they're able to charge. I mean, that's another challenge, when dealing with special population housing, is that oftentimes there are folks on a fixed income, whether it's, SSDI, SSI, Social Security, or Medicare and Medicaid waivers. You can't support the debt you would support if you had a different rent structure. So to the extent that there can be some operating subsidy brought in, whether it's through the 811 program or through traditional housing choice voucher program vouchers, that helps, because then you can leverage more debt that way, because it'll increase the amount of rent that comes into the property. We don't do a loan guarantee in the same way that what you're saying, the provincial government or the government of Canada did at the time. But what we do offer is pre-development funding for developers to do some of the legwork up front. We realize that's a lot of the cost to a developer comes up front with before there's any guarantee that they're going to get a project funded and have that money repaid. So we do, kind of easy access pre-development loans for that purpose, which then if the property proceeds, it gets paid for out of the closing transaction. And, we're able to bake that cost into the development cost. And, we're certainly, we're open to looking at new models as they come across.
Mhm.
And, we have a great policy group that kind of has a national perspective on trends in housing and what's going on. And, I can go back to them tomorrow, and I probably will after this conversation, and say, can you look around and see what other states are doing as far as, cooperative housing for disabled individuals and what those models work. As Sarah said, Connecticut had a program years ago, but I don't know that many other state housing finance agencies like us do have those type of opportunities. But I'm certainly willing to throw the net out and see what we can figure out.
Mhm.
I mean, we do have staff on hand who do that type of research all the time about a bunch of different things. And oftentimes it takes a conversation with folks in the community like yourself to make the light bulb go on for us and to say, oh, this is something we haven't thought about really, or how can we think about, a new way to incentivize this type of development within our traditional models. One of the things that we're trying to advocate for, as we go forward is not just the standard 5% units that are ADA compliant in a development. What can we do to incorporate principles of universal design into the developments we fund so that it's accessible to folks on an ongoing basis? And it's not, well, we only have 5 units that are appropriate for you. You have to get on a waiting list and who knows when it's going to happen. Or as you said, Sarah, that they're not specifically held aside for individuals if there's not a demand up front. It's easier, I think, over the long haul to develop units that could easily be adaptable to someone with particular needs than to say, this is what we have in our inventory and it's a static thing. So working with, we work with a number of architects over the years. We have relationships with most that do business in Rhode Island, and, having those conversations about what are the options for incorporating some universal design elements or incorporating different things into how we consider these units, whether it's, a square footage calculation or whether it's, certain things, certain amenities in the unit that are flexible or could be adapted rather easily.
Right. James, I've spotlighted Sarah, so you guys are sharing the spotlight at the moment. It looked like you were sort of leaping up to say something.
Yeah, I want to jump in on a couple of things James said, because one of the goals that many of us have is to just include a few of our family members or people with disabilities we care about in a much larger development of housing so that people aren't segregated and they're just part of the whole development. And so you mentioned 2 programs that I just want to highlight for the families. One is the Housing Choice Voucher, which used to be called Section 8. And the importance, I used to work with family groups and we had this approach that the goal was to get every family member on a list for a housing choice voucher. Sometimes the lists aren't open. So we had family members driving across the state because one city opened the list, and you could get on any list anywhere because the vouchers are mobile. You can use it wherever you want. So whenever a list opens up, it's great to get a family member on it. Now, the Massachusetts list is I think it's at least 13 years before your name will ever come up. And, it's a long waiting period, but if you get your 18-year-old on now, at least before they're 30, their name will come up. And so that's one, because that allows you to just pay 30% of your income for the rent, and allows you to rent just, a very expensive unit and make it almost, just totally within your income. So that's one thing to really highlight. And then James mentioned the Section 811 program, and that's a program designed to fund housing for people with disabilities. And it used to be that you could only use it for segregated housing. So everybody had to have a disability. But advocacy has led now to that being much more flexible. So James, correct me if I'm wrong, but you could conceivably encourage a developer to go after
Yep.
eight units of Section 811, and those 8 units would be in an 80 or 100 unit development. So your family member would be one of many, but they would get this highly affordable rent, because it would be allocated to just people with disabilities within this bigger development.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. And we absolutely do make that, a point in discussing with any developer, because we do have 811s available.
Right.
Unlike as you say, the HCVP waiting list is a long one. It's thankfully in Rhode Island is nowhere near 13 years, but it's not, you're not going to get a voucher tomorrow.
Right.
And so the 811s are a resource that we do have. And so we absolutely bring that to the attention of any developer when they come in for a project with us, particularly on the tax credit side. Say, listen, you can, exactly right. You can apply for 811s, and here's what it's going to do. Here's the subsidy you're going to get. It's going to help you leverage more debt. It's going to help your operating, numbers work better. And you're going to seamlessly integrate these folks into your larger community. And it's, the good thing about a program like that, a subsidy program like that, it's invisible to everybody else.
Right.
Right.
It doesn't shout out, hey, by the way, a disabled person is living here. It's completely a transaction which happens behind the scenes. And, they just live next door. That's just the deal.
So a family in Rhode Island could hear a development might be coming to their community and potentially go to that developer and go to you and say, we really want some of our family members here. They have very, very low incomes. You can talk with James at the housing agency, and we want to work out this process where this funding source gets allocated to your development.
Absolutely.
That's a scenario that families could kind of work on.
Yeah. Sharon Safford is asking, James, how long is the wait for a voucher in Rhode Island? And I think she's probably referring to the 811 voucher.
Well, the 811 vouchers right now, it's something that developers can access, when they're ready to, when they get approved for financing. We can make it part of their financing package, and it becomes based in the unit. So those 8 units, as long as they have a qualified individual living in them, will get that 811 subsidy. So for the regular housing choice voucher program, the wait list, we have a consolidated waiting list in the state that most of the communities participate in. Those are all administered by the local housing authorities, but you can go to a centralized wait list and apply, and the waiting times vary, per community. Obviously, places like Providence and Pawtucket, Woonsocket are going to have longer waits, but they also have more vouchers. Someplace small, like I live in East Greenwich, so our housing authority administers Section 8s. They don't have as many as the other communities, but the wait list is probably shorter. So it's just a function of, where you're living, where you want to live, and those different communities just have different wait times. There's not, I wish I had a stock answer for you,
but you can apply in any town and take it to another place. So if
yes, you can absolutely do that.
If a family heard that the waiting list was much lower over an hour away, they could go and apply in that town and be able to bring it where they want.
Over an hour away, they'd be in Mass or Connecticut, so
Oh, sorry.
you just can't drive an hour.
By horse. Sarah, let me ask you something. You've, obviously been part of a lot of these. And we were talking earlier about both Kathy and you, and some of us have been talking earlier about that sort of slide down toward just business in a housing co-op or a condominium, or even a condominium complex. I've always been attracted to the basic design idea that's behind co-housing, which includes a very deliberate development of shared spaces, shared office spaces, a shared workshop, a shared recreation space that keeps people coming together, that brings people together on a regular basis. Have you, for Sarah, have you run into that? And does that make a difference? Does that take the edge off of the thing just devolving into a straight business proposition? And James, would you see room for incorporating those kinds of common elements, common utilities in some of the development processes that Rhode Island is willing to finance?
Well, I want to speak to co-housing a minute. I mean, that's an amazing model. And there's a lot of co-housing being developed in New England, lots of interest. Well, I'm probably exaggerating a lot in terms of it's a new model and people are interested. And I think the way to use co-housing would be to ask James and his housing organization to invest in a few units in a co-housing development that they're typically, well, there are some that are being developed as affordable, but a lot of times people are buying in and they're, having different size units. And the amazing thing about co-housing is that at least all the original ones were developed where you shared food and you had a shared common dining area and people would cook certain nights and you'd really be eating together. And not that you'd eat together all the time, you'd have your own little kitchen, but that was really built in and that really helped build community. And, in co-housing, people still don't always get along and don't always like each other and all those kinds of things, but it has been an amazing community building model. And if you can find one being built that you can help a family member get into, that would be a fabulous option.
Yeah, and Asha, that's one example of a situation in which people invest equity,
Right.
or invest equity over time. The other thing that we've thought about and enacted a couple of times, and I think is always available, is to bring in somebody who can help a community that has sort of fallen into just a business operation, and bring folks back to thinking about how do we strengthen ourselves as a community, how do we strengthen our relationships with each other, our connections and our commitments to operate as a community. And we've used the path planning process sometimes as a way of doing that. I remember as we were leaving Winnipeg, where we had one converted warehouse building with 17 or 18 units in it, but also some scattered co-op houses, bringing that community together and having exactly that conversation, because it had been 8, 10, 12 years. And they needed to address those questions. So I think there are ways of facilitating and supporting people to remember why they came together in the first place, and how to sort of remember each other. Yeah,
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's not. It may not be it may not be the business model that is at fault. It's that we haven't been creating those opportunities to figure that out together. We have a friend in New York who moved into a regular, I guess, 15-story condo and revolutionized the place over time by creating opportunities for people to get to know each other. She was just very deliberate about that. So I think it's not always that the co-op model per se, or the condo model, or the co-housing model per se, sort of is on that inexorable slide to people not talking to each other, but we have to work at it.
James, I have a question kind of around this. So you do help people buy housing.
Yes.
Do you think that somebody who was going to buy into a co-housing model could come to you, to your agency, and get some assistance in making that purchase? This is basically, I'm sure you know about co-housing anyway,
Yeah.
but so because it's basically, it's just buying a house.
Yeah, I mean, my mind is going now because I don't think anybody's ever asked that question before. Obviously what we do, for the most part, all of our single family lending is for first time home buyers.
Mhm.
So to the extent that and it's all income qualified, folks in the lower income,
Yeah,
but if somebody fit all of our criteria,
yeah.
I don't know that we wouldn't. Yeah, I don't know that there'd be anything that would prohibit us from giving them a loan. I'd have to think it through, to be honest with you, and talk to our home ownership folks. But it's certainly a conversation I'm willing to have.
Yeah,
It's just,
I think that's
that's
great.
why I say it's great to have these conversations because you're going to bring up things that we haven't thought of.
Yep.
Because we tend to, obviously we have to think in terms of big blocks of things often, and like what's the most bang for the buck, and how do we deal with these larger issues? But something as simple as that, if we could provide an affordable loan for somebody in that situation.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
I know
have
that.
that conversation.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm gonna follow up on that. Just a little historical stuff. My wife and I, about 30 years ago, got connected with a bunch of people who were interested in co-housing here in Rhode Island. We got as many as 11 families got together, and our intention was we would buy a unit for our son, Mark. And he would move in there. We wouldn't move in there, but it would just be a unit for him.
And Mark would have been the only individual with a developmental disability
Right.
in that complex.
Right. And like David said, we started meeting together, eating together, doing a lot of stuff to kind of bond and build. The problem was that we could only ever get like 11 purchasers, and we needed 18 to make the project float, to make it work. And we could never, get over that. So it kind of fell apart. But I know that there's more co-housing going on in Mass than there is here. And I've never quite been able to figure out why. We were going to buy an abandoned mill in Warren, right on the bike path. It was like heaven, Somebody else has now bought it and developed it into something, I'm sure, But I think the hurdle in thinking about it was, so how does somebody like our son or us, we could probably have helped pay for it, but somebody who really didn't have the resources, how could they buy into it? And if they could get this thinking about, home of my own kind of mentality about home purchasing and home ownership, it wouldn't solve everybody's problem, but it would probably make it possible for a number of people.
Yeah. James, the reason I messaged you much earlier in your presentation was because you had mentioned Cambridge in your introduction. And the co-housing complex that John and I visited in Cambridge was unique in that it really wasn't geared for affordable housing. It was market value housing with a very few affordable units, like 3, 4 out of You remember how many, hun? It was a
Uh,
long time ago.
Yeah, it was probably about 75 or 80 units all told.
Um, and you know, I couldn't quite figure out how that funding was built in so that it really was a mixed income unit. And I'm sure you must have ideas about that. In
Yeah, I
fact,
mean,
were you involved with that one by any
I was
chance?
not involved with that one. I'm trying to think of what you're referring to. I mean, I know, I know where the railroad tracks are. We had a number of developments right up against the railroad tracks.
This was one of those.
The interest group that came together for that co-housing was that all these people were green. They used geothermal heating, they
Okay.
used the low amount of resources in their washing machines, etc.
Yep.
I don't know the language even.
Right. So as you guys can imagine, right? Cambridge is, legendary for its cooperative spirit and those type of solutions, historically. Not so much now that it's a wildly unaffordable place dominated by biotech, but there were a lot of unique housing models that arose around there. As I said, I'm not familiar exactly with the one you're talking about, but just in a typical way, whether it's mixed income rental or mixed income affordability, the rents or the prices that you charge for the market rates subsidize the lower end so that you can charge lower rents or sell the affordable units for a lower price. So it's basically strict economics in that sense. Is how many market rate units do you need to have X number of affordable units pencil out? It's pretty standard. It's just math, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, great.
So I know we're getting short on time and I just wanted to make my announcement. David told me to jump in. So
Yeah.
I work really closely with James and his team, Jessica and Eric Shorter. And what myself and Betty Murray, who's part of the board for the plan, have offered to hold these like office hours. So on February 17th from 6 to 7 on this Zoom link, we want families and individuals to come in and tell us what it is you're interested in. So we've been hearing about all these models from across the country and Canada for a while now. And I know people are wanting to make moves, and we've been talking about having everyone apply for housing vouchers and get on a list. So we want to hear from you. We want to see what you're interested in. We'll take those ideas back to James and his team, just so we can know, like maybe no one on this call is interested in a co-op, but they're interested in something different. Maybe more people than we know of are interested in home ownership. But you can bring that to us on the 17th and we will bring it back so we can start looking at how we can replicate things in Rhode Island.
Great.
That's great.
Yeah, so it is probably time to wrap it up. So first of all, thank you to you two guys. Bob, I know we're good friends, so you'll forgive me that I didn't even ask you to talk, but you're around, you'll be around later, and I'm sure we'll get some of your input too. But this has been wonderful to have this discussion and the fact that we're starting to kind of create these coalitions. I think it was James who said it. We need to work together. We're moving away actually from that idea of specialized disability housing. Our vision and plan, and I think for a lot of people, is that people with disabilities live where they grew up, and because they're surrounded by friends and neighbors and family who know them, that they live in kind of natural proportions, that we don't want to dominate or overwhelm communities, and that people can move. A lot of people have gotten this idea that people with disabilities, once they're 18 or 20 or 25 and you solve their housing problem, it's been solved forever. And I don't believe that that's at all the case. I think people naturally need to move around as they age and as they gain different experiences. So it's important to have variety and flexibility in building up those options. So it's good to hear about these options. Like somebody said, maybe nobody wants to do that right now. Or maybe somebody says, yeah, I'm interested in that, especially if there's an opportunity to kind of be creative about the financing of it. So thank you all. Remember, this link is good for the next 5 or 6 months, and Michelle is going to use it for some time. If other people want to get together just to talk, we're happy to host those kinds of conversations. Okay.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank
James,
you.
and Sarah,
Oh, thank you guys for having me. This was wonderful.
Will
Okay.
be.
Thank
Uh,
Come
you.
back again, James. We like
Yeah.
you.
Well,
Please.
Thank you so much.
so now that